right, so let me share the screen. Okay, so we had just started this discussion yesterday. What is going to be the halacha? This is just a long discussion in the biurim. It seems pretty intuitive to us that if an upstairs neighbor has a leaky pipe and it leaks into the downstairs neighbor, then it becomes the upstairs neighbor's responsibility to fix the pipe. But he says that there's actually a discussion about this in the Gemara. He says, "V'yesh la'ayin echadin im na'aseh eitzel Reuven kilkol b'tzineret ha'in satlatzia b'koma ha'elyona." He says, what will be the din when it comes to indoor plumbing? He's got some plumbing problem on the upper floor. So such that whenever Reuven, who's on the top floor, turns on his faucet, water starts leaking. And it starts to drip or soak into the ceiling of the lower occupant. So things drip in, and it's causing damage to the property of Shimon. So who's responsible for fixing the leaky pipe? It seems pretty clear that it's the upstairs guy. We don't even think in terms of the responsibility of the lower floor. But he says, but he says that there's actually a Gemara that discusses an issue that is similar to this, even though there was no indoor plumbing in the times of the Gemara. So there were two people who were living in a house. One was on the upper floor and one was on the bottom floor. So Ifchit, I'm going to bring up the Gemara in Sepharia so that we have the Gemara in front of us. Let's take a look. Kuf Yud Zayin. Bava Metzia, Kuf Yud Zayin. Amud Aleph. Okay, so here's the Gemara in front of you. It's both in English and in Hebrew. An incident occurred with two people who were residing in the same house, one in the upper story and the other one in the lower story. The plaster of the floor. So he says, are you able to see it? Do you have it on your screen?
No.
Okay, let me share the screen with you. Sorry. Here we go. There we go. So the Gemara says, Ifchis ma'azeva, so the plaster of the floor of the upper story broke, so that when the resident of the upper apartment would wash with water, it would run down and cause damage to the lower story. The question was, who must repair the ceiling? Rabbi Chia bar Abba says the upper resident repairs it, and Rabbi Eloi says in the name of Rabbi Chia, son of Rabbi Yossi, the lower resident repairs it. And the Gemara comments, and the following verse can serve as a mnemonic, the Yosef who rad Mitzrayma, that Yosef was brought down to Egypt. Rabbi Chia, son of Rabbi Yossi, indicated by Yosef, is the sage who maintains that the owner of the lower story indicated by brought down must repair the ceiling. Okay, now, what is the basis of the machlokas? Why would you think you have two people, one on the upper story, one on the bottom story? A guy in the upper story is the source of the damage, but the damage is only coming to him because of a broken pipe that's dripping down into the lower story. So we're talking about when you have indoor plumbing and there's a broken pipe, who's responsible for fixing it? It's in an apartment building, right? So the Gemara suggests, Lema Reb Chia bar Abba v'Rabbi Eloi beplukta Reb Yossi v'Rabbanan kamiflagi. Laman do Amar ha'elyon mitakin kesavar al hamazik laharchik es asma min hanizik. Uman do Amar tachton mitakin kesavar al hanizik laharchik es asma min hamazik. So the question is, when you have a person who's the source of damage, but it's just as easy for the person who's being injured to distance himself. So whose responsibility is? Is it the source of damage to distance himself, or is the damagee obligated to distance himself? So the Gemara says, "V'tispera Rabbi Yossi v'Rabbanan le'inyan nezikin pligi v'ha'ibcha shaminu lahu." Okay, so the Gemara says, but that's not they don't normally understand that this is what they're arguing about. Okay. The case that Rabbi Yossi and the Chachamim are discussing is if a guy plants a tree by a pit, and the roots of the tree are protruding into the pit, who's obligated upon whose obligation does the owner of the tree have to cut down the tree, or does the owner of the pit have to dig another well? So it all depends on who was there first. And the question is, I planted my tree on my property, you planted your pit on your property. And the roots of my tree are starting to damage your pit, and I say to you, dig your pit elsewhere. So in any event, the Gemara goes through a long discussion as to what the machlokus between the two of them is. But before we go further into that Gemara, let's take a look at the biur. So Umasik Sham, he says, Umasik Sham, says the biurim, the pluktaton mairi ba'ofen the paski maya b'hodar nafli, that the Gemara says in its conclusion as to what the machlokus is as far as whether the top guy has to fix the ceiling or the bottom guy has to fix the ceiling, is the paski maya b'hodar nafli. What does that mean? Pirish Rashi, lo hayta rechitzat yadayim shel elyon al makom nizke hatachton ela b'makom acher misham hem nimshachim ad shenoflim b'makom shemaziken ad kan lashona. He says the explanation is that there was not direct damage from the guy pouring water on his hands. That's really what they used water for indoors. He would pour water on his hands, and if there was directly a leak from where the water was falling on the floor and it went straight down, everyone would agree that it's the top guy's obligation. But what would happen is that he poured water on his hands, and the water flowed, let's say on an incline, down to where the leak was, and then it fell on the guy's things and damaged the other guy's things. Because of Sham Harif, the Hilchos Rabbi Chia bar Yosef the Koi Rabbi Yosef, and the Rif paskins that the obligation is, we paskin like Reb Chia bar Yosef. And what did Reb Chia bar Yosef say? That the guy on the bottom has to fix. Ba'afol gav the Omer Ravashi ki havinan be Rav Kahana havrin amonda Reb Yosef begira delay. Hani maya lav gira ditu ninhu the maya taimi upasku v'hadar azli. He says, even though in a situation where the water was coming straight down, the top person would be responsible. But in a situation where the water is not directly coming from my hands, but it has to roll down an incline until it comes down into your property, he says that's not direct damage. And therefore, the Rif feels that it's not something that you can pin on me on the top floor. And if you're not happy on the bottom floor with water coming into your room, then you have an obligation to fix it. The Shaminan Mina, we learn from here, the Heicha Deleka Ma'azeva, the Taimi Bamaya Bahadar Azal, the Gira Didei Ninhu Ha'elyon Mitaken Adkan Devar. But what you can infer from here is when the water is coming directly from the efforts of the guy on the top floor. And we'll see how that applies to a leaky pipe that only starts leaking as soon as he turns on the faucet. He says that would make the top person responsible. He says, when we look at this discussion, we discover that there are many different ways that the Rishonim discuss this halacha. He says, let's first think about this for a second. Why would we say that the guy on the top floor in certain circumstances would be exempt from having to pay? He says, in all situations, whether the water is coming straight down or whether it's flowing on an incline and then going down to damage the guy on the bottom, they're coming from the guy on top. He's washing his hands. The water is coming from him, from his property. Why shouldn't he always be responsible? What gives the guy on the top floor the right to do this if he knows that whenever he pours water on his hands, it's going to end up damaging something on the bottom floor? So it's really a bit of a mystery why this Gemara is even a question. One approach is by the Nimuke Yosef, who's one of the Rishonim who comments on the Rif. The Kaimelan Dezenotea Bimakomo, Afal Pishahim Ovrim Labor Chaveru Mazikin Osa. He says one of the approaches that is suggested is that I have every right to plant a tree on my property, even though the roots may actually end up growing out and entering into my neighbor's property. Velo chashivi giri delay, kaven she'enon mazikim miyad adkan devara. And even though my roots may end up growing into your property, it's not considered to be a direct act of mine, what's called gira delay. Gira delay literally means my arrows. I shoot an arrow, okay, that's direct damage coming from me. But let's say I do something and that only as a result of my actions over time, very, very gradually and very, very slowly, damage will be caused as a result of that action. So am I considered to be the responsible party? Now, obviously, the roots came from my tree. So you would say, of course. But no, maybe halachically, maybe I have an ethical obligation, but I don't have a halachic obligation to cut my roots. Yes, Mordechai. The neighbor, right, I can tell the neighbor, you don't like the roots, you can cut the roots. It's he can do on his property whatever he wants. The question is, am I responsible for the so that would be an interesting question. Do I have a right to cut the roots if it's going to kill the tree? But that's not the question that's undertaken here. The question is can I be assessed for the damage that my roots caused to you? Let's say my roots grew into your property and they ended up damaging a well, or they ended up damaging a structure a fence on your property. So there is one opinion that says that I cannot be assessed because this is something that grows on its own, even though I planted the tree, but nevertheless, it's not gira delay. It's not a direct result of my action. It's something that only happened much later in a gradual fashion.
Rabbi, it seems very much that the tree roots is less direct than the leaking roof or the leaking roof, it's going to go down, and that's roots go whichever way they want. And once you've planted the tree, you have no control really. So I don't really see the analogy as clearly.
The analogy that is being made, at least at face value, is that anything that's an indirect result, both chronologically and through that there are other factors that contribute to the movement of this source of damage, right? Then I cannot be assessed for the damage because it's not a direct result of my effort.
Right. I understand. I think there's degrees of indirectedness, if you will.
Yes, you're right. Your point is well taken, Paul. But he says, let's read a little bit more. Maybe this will be the challenge that you made, Paul. That Reb Stern says, he says, I'm disturbed by the analogy. He says this case is not analogous to tree roots. He says, when I planted the tree, these roots didn't even exist. The roots did not exist. The Rush actually says that the reason I can argue that I'm patur when my tree grows roots is because when I planted the tree and I put the tree in the ground, my action did not directly result in the growth of the roots because the roots weren't in existence. If I put something in the ground that is already here, that just pushing a button makes them go out and punch a hole in your property, that's something else. But if when I put the tree in the ground, the roots didn't even exist, so that's the reason why I can argue that I'm patur. He says, "V'im kein nidon zeh shehu shofechet hamayim biyadav v'hemagim lamata lenizak." He says, therefore, here the water is the source of damage. The water exists whenever I pour it over my hands. I know that water is going to trickle down and eventually damage the bottom neighbor's property. Madua shori lo lasus kein lechatchila. What right do I have to do this, knowing that I'm pouring water that's eventually going to pour into the other guy's property? So he says that there's another way of looking at it from another Rishon called the Yad Ramah. He says, "Aval im amdu baderech machmat davar sheikvan, ulabasof nimshchu me'eleihen v'holchu lavgi rei minhu." So he says that it's the criterion is the fact that there was something that impeded the flow of the water, so that it did not flow directly from my hands into my neighbor's property. He says, "The cholhecha the tami maya v'hader azli lav gira ninhu adkan lashona." He says that's the reason why I can be patur according to this opinion, is that when I pour the water over my hands, they form into a puddle, they stop, and then only later do they flow. Okay. Umavor bidvar of the haven the hapirish begamara the tamimaya hainu shamari ba'ofen shamayim ne'etzarim legamre b'shuv nimshachim me'eleihem. He says the water accumulates in a puddle, and then when I pour some more water over my hands, the puddle overflows. So it's not directly a result from my actions. The zehavi kekoach chadash, and he says, and that's why it's considered something new. He says, so that's another way of looking at the argument. And I want to just skip over a few things because we're going to get bogged down in some of the details. He says, let me just skip down over here. Okay, he says, Od Perush Shenemar Besug Yezu Hushitas Harith Harambam. Another way of looking at this discussion is from the Rith and the Rambam. and it's quoted by the Shulchan Aruch as follows. He says, if water from the top floor comes in and damages the bottom floor, im ein sham ma'azeva b'inyan shekesheshofech meimav miyad yordim l'tachtun u'mazikin oto, chayav l'salek hezeko. He says, if there's no incline that the water flows down so that it's a direct flowing downwards from my hands into the hole that's in the ceiling, and then it goes into my friend's property, so then I am not allowed to do that. I have to distance whatever I'm doing from causing damage to my friend. But he says, Vim yesh ma'azeva shahamayim nivloim ba ve'enam yordim miyad. But if the water that I pour on my hands gets absorbed into the walls of the ceiling between my property and my neighbor's property downstairs, and then el la'achar mikan yordim u'mazikim, and then over the course of time, the water starts dripping out of the ceiling. So he says, Eino chayv l'salek hezeko. I'm not obligated to stop. I'm not obligated to stop washing my hands. And the Ramah says, v'hakol lefi ha'inyan. Each case has to be taken on a case by case. The im hamayim mu'atim v'kolam la'alter, afilu below ma'azeva hino chayiv l'salek hezeko. The im hayu merubin u'maziken lo tadir derech ha'mazeva chayiv l'salko. He says it depends on the frequency of the water, the amount of the water that's coming down to cause the damage. Everything will depend upon how direct the water's flowing down to the bottom floor is coming from my pouring of water on the upstairs. He says, and that all depends on the amount of use, the volume of water. Everything will have to be taken into account, says the Ramah. It'll have to be judged as how direct the water's flow into the downstairs neighbor is coming from the upstairs neighbor. And then the Ramah says something interesting. He says, Avalim yardu geshamim al ha'elyon, v'yardim lamata, al hanizak latakein shelo yuzak ad kan lashana. But let's say rain is leaking into the upstairs apartment. And then because it's leaking, the rain is leaking into the upstairs apartment, it leaks also into the downstairs apartment. So then the Ramah says the downstairs neighbor is the one who's solely responsible to fix his ceiling to prevent the water from coming in. Now that's very, very unusual also. You would think that the upstairs neighbor has a responsibility to prevent the water from coming into his apartment, but he says no. So he says, this also is mysterious. He says, V'hinei divrei ha'Ramah tzarich biur. V'lechora eino muvan. D'ma ha'tam d'mamayim mu'atim afilu below ma'azeh ve'enu chayv l'salek hezeko. V'chi b'nizakin yesh chiluk ben hezek rav l'muat. The first question I have is, what difference does it make the volume of water? The Ramah seems to say that if it's a small amount of water, then even if it's flowing directly from my hand washing to my downstairs neighbor, I can be exempt. What difference does it make what volume of water? If it's a direct damage, it's a direct damage. Oh, yesh lahakshos the makor divrei haRamah b'seifem divrei v'rahavosh siman taf kuf yud zayin. He says, and furthermore, what he talks about with the rainfall is based upon the commentary of the Rivash, another Rishon. He says, Aval benid, and who writes, Aval benidon zeh shemei hageshamim yovo me'elehen ve'ein ze osa b'hen davar v'gam lo nichalei lazeh sheyerdu sham ein kan girei klal v'lo dami la'avno v'sakino she'nichan b'rosh gago v'noflo b'ruch mitzui v'hezika sh'chayiv l'sham. The Rivash writes that if rain falls into my upstairs apartment and I'm not happy with it, and as a result of it falling into my apartment, it leaks into the downstairs neighbor, he says there it's got nothing to do with my efforts, and therefore I, as the upstairs tenant, do not have to pay for it because I'm not doing anything to cause the damage. It's happening on its own. Aval benidon zeh eno mamono ve'eno chafetz liskos behen v'im enom yordim b'pshiaso ve'eno logire ve'lo garma degire ad kan l'shono. So the Rivash basically says is because the rainwater that's coming into my upstairs apartment, I don't want that water. It's not my property. And therefore, I don't have to take responsibility for it. That's the argument that the Rivash gives as to when rain comes into my apartment and leaks down into your apartment, I'm not responsible. So he says, "V'hashta lefizeh yesh lahakshot di'im haheter hu mishum shemei hageshamim enam mamono v'gam enam yordim b'pshiyatim ken heichashu shofech et memav biyadayim kibedinu demar be'harama madua lo nechayvehu mishum ha dehaminiach avno v'sakinu maso al rosh kago ubaruch mitzuya shechayav d'harei l'divrei harivash rak b'geshamim yesh tam lepotro mishum she'enam boim b'pshiyato ve'enam mamono." He says, if that's the case, the Rivash is making a distinction between rainwater that's falling naturally and property of mine, like my water, that I'm pouring onto my neighbor. He says, if that's the case, then why wouldn't the Ramah obligate me whenever I pour water, even if it's falling indirectly into my neighbor's downstairs apartment? So he says the whole thing just doesn't make any sense. The whole thing is bizarre, explains Reb Stern, and we have to come to some kind of resolution as to why this halacha is true. He says, "Aval hayishav l'kush yazu nira al pi mashakasav hataz bezel l'sham." So to try and get to the bottom of it, let me quote, he says for you, the Taz, who writes as follows, "De'im hu muat eno yorei tekaf lamata, ela ragil liyot nivla bekarka ha'ma'azeva, be'alkein imikri v'yored lamata derech ha'ma'azeva lo nikra gira delay ad kan l'shana." The Taz basically says that it has to do with the time lag. The very fact that when I pour water on my hands and it flows into the walls of the ceiling, and then it accumulates there, and only after a certain amount of time it starts leaking downwards. He says that's the reason why I can argue that I'm exempt, because it's not a direct result of my activity. It's an indirect result of my activity. So he says, now he goes into a long further discussion. As you can see, this whole next page, and it goes on into even the third page. So we're not going to have time to go into this whole discussion, but let me give you the bottom line. He says, so to conclude, he's going to come up with six different conclusions, six halachic conclusions that we can draw from this entire discussion. And that's something that we'll go into Be'ezrat Hashem tomorrow. Okay, we'll hold it here for today. But clearly you see it's not something that's so obvious that when there's an indirect damage that's being caused as a result of my property, sometimes I'm not going to be necessarily held liable according to halacha. Okay, have a great day, everyone.